This is a very interesting subject. For centuries now, when a crime has been committed, a number of people have been gathered in a room to watch and listen to the person who's been accused of the crime. And they've watched for body language, they've listened for tone of voice, for little inconsistencies in the stories told. And essentially what they've been doing is using a natural human ability to try to figure out what's in somebody else's mind. But what if you could actually read another person's mind? What if you could read their very thoughts? Brain science has reached the point now, or is reaching it, where they have made amazing advances in the ability to see what's going on in someone else's mind. And this raises some interesting questions, like, how close are we to a time when brain science will be in the courtroom determining guilt or sentencing? Is it going to lead to a more just society or a less just one? And how about this? Are we entitled to think that our private thoughts are in fact private and should remain so and will remain so, regardless of the technology that might develop to read our private thoughts? Where do we stand with that? So all of these questions and many more are dealt with in the PBS series that I'm hosting, and that'll be on PBS in September. And we've asked a number of the experts who appear in that show to come on stage today and help us figure out how brain science might have an enormous impact on the justice system. These are people who are expert both in neuroscience and in the justice system. So let's ask our first couple of people to come out now. Our first participant is a professor at Duke University who closely follows how neuroscience may affect our legal system. She focuses on the legal, philosophical, and social issues that arise from developments in the biosciences. So please welcome Nita Farahany. Hi, Nita.
Hi.
As a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Stanford University, our next participant has made tremendous strides in figuring out how to answer that age-old question, what's on someone's mind? Please welcome Anthony Wagner. Hi, Anthony. How are you? So we're going to divide today into two pieces, two parts. The first part is figuring out someone's guilt in a courtroom. And then comes the phase of the trial that will be our second half, sentencing. Once you decide if a person is guilty, what do you do then with that guilty person? How do you sentence that person? So we three can talk about the guilty part of the trial, the guilt phase. And in that, I think two really important questions are, is the person telling the truth? So lie detection is a real issue. And another big issue is eyewitnesses, the reliability of eyewitnesses. And both of these things have come under fire, I think, recently, in terms of the established ways, the established ways we have of determining that. There's new work that some people claim can actually enable us to determine whether a person is telling the truth using an MRI machine, picking up magnetic signals from the brain. Let's take a look at a short video from Brains on Trial and just get a feel for how this imaging is supposed to work. And what happened to me, I was put in the thing. I was asked to choose whether I was going to steal a ring or a watch from a drawer. And the machine was going to figure out which one I took. So let's take a look at the video. The ring or the watch? I had been told to take either the ring or the watch to see if a scan of my brain could catch me in a lie. I'm really tempted to take them both.
This right here is the keypad.
Steve Lakin, the head of a company called Cephos, claims he can tell by scanning my brain which item I took from the drawer. After about an hour using his patented computer algorithms to analyze the scans, Lakin was ready with an answer. So I hear you have a result.
I do. I do have a result. Are you interested in seeing how you did?
Yeah.
Or maybe I should say how I did?
Yeah, right. Lakin focuses on 3 areas in the brain that he argues have to work harder when someone is telling a lie. In my case, these regions showed more activity when I was answering the ring questions than the watch questions. So, what do you think I took out of the drawer?
The computer made the determination that you took the ring.
Uh-huh. You want to find out if I did?
I do. All right. Very good.
You look a little relieved.
Am I always relieved? Sure. Absolutely. You know, we do impact people's lives with what we do. Much more important than rings and watches. And, you know, when we get these things right, when we do this, it does lend credibility to what we're doing when it really does make a difference.
So he's right. This is very important. Is this reliable, do you think? What do you think, Anthony? Is this a reliable test he's giving me?
We don't know. So happy to sort of join in on this very point. There's been about 40 studies along the lines that you participated in, where you bring subjects into the experiment, you have them encounter a set of stimuli, maybe they make a choice, such as you made a choice to take the ring over the watch. Subjects go into the scanner and their brains are scanned while they're answering yes and no questions typically. And across those 40 studies, very much like the video clip just demonstrated, there are parts of the brain in the lateral side, the outer side of the frontal lobes, the bottom parts of the frontal lobes and the parietal lobes that are across the studies consistently, not in every study, but are consistently more active when people are answering falsely, when they're instructed to respond negatively, falsely, to lie, as you were, relative to when they're instructed to tell the truth. So there's consistency across these studies. The question is that you're posing and that the technology poses is, can we reliably detect a lie? My read of the literature, and this is where we'll spend some time talking, is that we really don't know. And that's because these studies are complex. When we make these sort of responses, true and false responses, there are many kinds of cognitive or mental processes that we use to make those responses. And
the use of the polygraph, I think, is not allowed anymore in court, is it? Is it accepted as evidence?
It's not accepted. In fact, a number of years back,
So
please.
It depends, right? So
Yeah.
in most states it isn't allowed. There are a few states that do allow for it to be used, but it almost never is because it doesn't get past scientific standards of admissibility into the courtroom.
Yeah.
But you know, the polygraph is just one of the many ways that we've tried to find the holy grail of truth-telling in the criminal justice system or in the legal system more generally. There are truth serums, there's, you know, different ways in which pseudoscience has been introduced into the courtroom for centuries now, trying to figure out if the person on the stand is actually telling us the truth. This is one more attempt at doing so.
So do we think that neuroimaging is any more effective in judging lying than, say, dunking? No, I mean, how much faith can we put in it? Is there a percentage? How does it stack up against the polygraph?
So
Yeah,
here are what the studies tell us, what the accuracy is. But I want to loop back, as you know, to the question as to whether these are reported accuracies about picking up lying or picking up something else.
So in other words, it may be picking up something that is not indicative of lying necessarily.
Absolutely.
Like what would that
Absolutely.
be?
Well, so let's think about the experience you had.
Yeah.
If memory serves, you gave some thought as to which stimulus, which item, the
Yeah,
ring
and I
or the
really
watch.
was tempted to take both of them because I wanted to see what would happen to the study if I took both.
But I believe you told me that prior to walking over to the drawer and taking the ring, you had planned it all out. You had you understood that you were going to have to make this choice. That you had thought, well,
Yeah.
I'm going to take the ring and leave the watch. Then you walked over, you opened the drawer, selected the ring, took it in, put it in the locker. Right? In the locker. You have with the ring, a rich set of experiences, much richer set of experiences
So that
than you
would
have with the watch.
make a bigger impression on my brain somehow.
The ring is more meaningful to you,
Yeah.
and you have memories of having thought about planning to take the ring,
Yeah.
having gone over and taken the ring, and having placed it amongst your things. So while there's this, the literature on fMRI lie detection is about 10, 11 years old. There's consistency across studies. There's a handful of studies that give us accuracies. They range from the lower 70s to somewhere in the 90s in terms of whether you can determine whether or not the person is lying or telling the truth. But you now can do the following experiment, and there's been a couple of these in the literature, and I think that these are the critical experiments. Have somebody like you go through the whole procedure, decide whether to take the ring or not, take the ring, put it amongst your things, and now you go into the scanner, and instead of having to lie in an instructed manner or tell the truth, all you're asked to do is watch a computer screen as stimuli are shown, as the ring and the watch and other items show up. And the brain patterns, the brain signals that are picked up in these lie detection studies also respond when you're looking at the ring, but are not lying relative to you're looking at the watch. And that's because the ring means something to you. It captures your attention, and because you have memories associated with the ring now more so than you have with the watch, and you're getting brain patterns. My interpretation of the literature is getting brain patterns that have to do with memory.
So is anybody doing that study to test the reaction to that stimulus?
Hopefully, so where are we in terms of the field? That study has been done. There's been a number of studies very much along those lines that have been done where you're asking what is the brain response, what is the subject's response to a stimulus after they'd interacted with it versus not.
Well, let me ask you
And you
something.
get these different brain responses.
It seems very much in the realm of possibility that you may have a number of people who think of committing a crime, maybe even plan it out in their heads, maybe not conspire with anybody, just saying, there's that jewel in that window, and I could break in one night, I could come at 10 o'clock, really get detailed about it, and then say, nah, it's too risky, I'm not going to do it. But if you put them in the scan where either you ask them did they take the jewel, or you show them the picture of the jewel, aren't they liable to show activation similar to the person who really took it?
They may well. In our lab, we focus heavily on the brain basis of memory. And we use brain imaging to try to do that. And one thing that we and other labs have demonstrated is that perceiving ongoing events versus imagining events engage patterns of activity in multiple parts of our cortex, the outer layers of the brain, as well as parts of the brain below the cortex. You can engage these patterns just by imagining particular acts. If I imagine a face versus I imagine a watch, I elicit a pattern of activation across the cortex that reflects something about my mental representation of a face. Later on, we've shown, and others have shown, that if I ask you and I probe your memory for what you imagined versus I probed your memory for what you actually encountered, the brain patterns that are associated with replaying those events, imagined events and real events, they're quite similar. There's some distinctions, but they're very similar.
It sounds really hard to determine that one is indicating a lie and the other is just indicating thinking about it or having an emotional response to it in some way.
You could end up with a crime with much more, you'd figure out what are the salient features of the crime, right? So perhaps a particular weapon that was used in a crime that you don't actually put out into the public. You often see that you keep details during an investigation secret from the general public. And so if you bring in a suspect and the suspect has associations with some unique feature of the crime that hasn't been made public, probably you're not imagining that. Probably you're not thinking about doing it in exactly the same way that the crime was actually committed.
Especially if it hasn't been made public and suddenly his brain goes, woo, he sees the place where the body is buried. But
you would have to keep something secret. You would have to keep it back.
You would have to have kept it secret.
Yeah.
But that raises a question in my mind. Is that something that you just described, is that something you might be more likely to do when you're trying to figure out who deserves further investigation, rather than something that you'd bring into the court and say, look, his brain lit up at this, so he's probably guilty. It doesn't sound as good for proof of guilt as a police aid to finding out who you should look into. What do you think?
I think it could be used as part of an investigatory technique. I mean, there's a number of things from neuroscience that are developing that might enable us to better investigate crimes. The question that raises for me is, what kinds of constitutional or other legal protections might a person have which would preclude the police from being able to do so? So I'm in an interrogation room and they say, you know what, I think you have information that's related to the crime, so we're going to stick you into a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner and ask you a series of questions. Probably there are some procedural things that they'd have to overcome in order to get me into the scanner, but my read of most of the law is that there's nothing clear-cut that would protect us against that kind of thing if we are a legitimate suspect in a crime.
But they need a warrant to look in your desk. Don't they need something like that to look in your head?
Well, but once you get a warrant, all a warrant is we have a right to actually do the search.
Yeah.
Once they actually have the warrant, it doesn't protect anything that's in your head. So if I have information in there and I say, no, I want to keep it all a secret from you, you can't have access to my memories, you can't have access to my thoughts, what's going to protect you once they get the warrant? And right now, I don't think anything.
This wouldn't call up new language in the warrants? I mean, doesn't it seem like a greater invasion of your private possessions?
It does, but right now, the way that the Fourth Amendment, which is the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, protects us against unreasonable searches and seizures, the way that concept of unreasonableness has been interpreted is how physically invasive is a search. It protects you against a certain kind of intrusion, which is an intrusion against your physical body and space, but it doesn't protect you against intrusion into your secret. So once I get your diary, I might be able to read the contents of it. It's not the contents that are protected, it's me breaking down the door to get the diary in the first place. And so, a brain scan is really minimally invasive in the physical sense. It just might be very invasive in the sense that our secrets are now available for full view.
I just thought it was always a good thing to be able to have bad thoughts.
What are you telling us, Alan?
Don't we have a constitutional protection to have bad thoughts?
Yeah. Careful, my kids are here. I don't know what they're...
We're talking a lot about the fMRI machine, the functional MRI. And I think it'd be a good idea to make a distinction between the MRI and the functional MRI. I at first thought, I think, a functional MRI was one that actually worked.
You hope.
But it really means it's relating to how the brain is functioning.
Right.
So that if I have this right, correct me, the MRI shows you where everything is in the body, but it doesn't show you it working.
That's right.
But in the functional MRI, you're actually doing tasks, and you can see what's activated in the brain during those tasks.
That's right.
Let's run a video so we get a clearer picture of that, because we're going to be talking about this a lot today. In functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, a person is slid into a large and extremely powerful donut-shaped magnet. It's the key technology we'll be encountering as we explore how neuroscientists are probing brains. The scanner creates images of multiple slices through the brain, picking out regions where a cluster of nerve cells among the several billion in the brain are working especially hard. Harder working cells need more blood to fuel them. This extra blood flowing through the nest of capillaries surrounding the nerve cells generates a magnetic signal. And it's this signal, an indirect measure of nerve cell activity, that the fMRI machine detects and displays. That reminds me that one of the things that it seems to me is a problem with using the fMRI as a lie detector is that it's not that hard to trick into getting a false reading, right?
Well, there's a little bit of data on that. Because there are a couple of things with MRI and functional MRI that are critical for them to sort of yield useful data. One is your subject has to be sufficiently compliant enough that they don't move their head. If you move your head inside the scanner, the data is moving all around, and it's very difficult
Can
to
they tell that you
actually
moved
analyze.
your head?
You can tell if you can, and so you can overcome that.
Yeah.
So now the question is, well, are there other ways to kind of beat the system? Can you actually engage in mental operations that might mask the fact that you're lying or telling the truth, or might mask whether you have guilty knowledge, you have a memory for some crime-relevant fact?
So you're answering their questions, but you're multiplying 12 times 203. Or,
It's
Something
even
very much
simpler.
along those lines. What,
Yeah.
the one, sorry.
Well, I mean, so Anthony put me into his scanner voluntarily, and and he asked me to try to employ countermeasures to see whether or not faces that he had shown me previously were faces that I actually recognized. And he didn't instruct me how. He just said, see if you can beat the system so that when you see a face that is one you've seen before, you trick the machine into thinking it's a face you've never seen before.
and how did you do that? How did you go about tricking it?
Well, so I would just find random spots on the screen that were either new or that were recognizable to me. And I would just focus on it and think like, wow, that is such an interesting, novel, new spot of dust that I've never seen before. Or, I'd see an image that was an image I'd never seen, and I would just think of a person who I know really well. And I would just think, that person really looks like so-and-so. And I would just create a elaborate imagery around the person who I knew. And it took a pretty high accuracy of being able to detect when I was right or wrong. You'll know the numbers, I won't.
You were in the 70s.
Right.
We were able to decode from your brain whether or not you were recognizing the face or perceiving it as novel when you were cooperating.
Right.
Somewhere
When
in the
she
70s.
was trying to trick the machine, she was
we
very
were at
successful
chance.
at it, right?
She was very successful.
And it's
Accuracy
interesting.
fell to chance.
I think on the internet now you can find pages that explain to you how to defeat the polygraph,
Right.
the old-fashioned polygraph. As soon as this becomes used in a widespread way, there are sure to be people coaching one another on the web on how to defeat it.
Sure.
And so
Your
that's-
defense attorney is going to say to you before you go into the room, just think of a pink elephant over and over again, and you will just focus on your pink elephant, and they'll, it'll be an
well,
effective
some
countermeasure.
defendants are already focused on that.
Yes, no, that's true. That's true. Okay.
Or even the one fMRI study of lie detection that explored this question. They were, when the subject was cooperating, when the subjects were cooperating, they were about 100, they reported 100% accuracy in being able to determine whether or not the person was lying when they were instructed to lie versus telling the truth. When they told the subject, now in the next part of the experiment, when you're lying or telling the truth, make very tiny micro movements of your fingers and your toes, such that an observer couldn't actually watch the motion, couldn't observe the motion, detect the motion. The performance fell from 100% down to 33% accuracy.
Wow. And you wouldn't want to put somebody in jail on those odds.
No.
I mean, it would be,
Although you have to ask the question, what is our accuracy of detecting a lie today? Right, so
Yes.
anytime we look at new scientific information to be introduced into the courtroom, we're terrible at telling whether or not a person is telling the truth or a lie. And a lot of the ways in which we try to tell whether a defendant is telling the truth or a lie, or a witness is telling a truth or a lie, are things like, what are they wearing? Or what's their affect like? And
if somebody said it doesn't show
emotion.
obvious remorse,
Right.
and they're accused of murder.
Right.
As a neuroscientist, Nita and I've gotten to know each other through the MacArthur Network's network on neuroscience and the law. And one thing that strikes me as it's hard to understand is this legal principle that Nita just mentioned. And what came up in one of the three court cases, where there was an effort to enter fMRI lie detection. And that is this notion of the province of the jury, that in essence, fMRI-based lie detection that might be able to, if it ever gets developed to that point, tell us something about whether or not the person on the stand is or is not telling the truth. Apparently, from one legal perspective, those determinations are actually, that's the responsibility and the purview of the jury, and yet we're leaving it to our fellow humans who are making these determinations based on in-group, out-group, subtle implicit biases perhaps under certain contexts, noise.
When Nita brought up the influence that it might have on jurors, what sweater they're wearing, or
Right.
how they're dressed, what their affect is, there's an added problem when you bring in evidence from this multi-million-dollar machine.
Right.
with important science behind it, and the defense lawyer says, this is science telling you, that's more impressive than a sweater even. And the jury is liable to be swayed by that unfairly.
Maybe. This is an interesting area that people are trying to explore. So some of the earlier studies took things where they would give people reasons. Okay, so they would give them statements, and the statements would be illogical statements, and people would recognize that they're bad illogical statements. And then you put a pie chart next to the bad illogical statements, and people were a little bit less convinced that they were bad illogical statements. And then you would put brain scans that have absolutely nothing to do with the bad illogical statements next to them, and people would be maybe unsure, like maybe it's not such a bad illogical thing. Exactly the same arguments, just adding pie charts and brain scans to it. So it's possible that throwing in scientific evidence convinces people to set their own logical reasoning aside. Some of the more recent studies suggest that might not be true, and part of efforts like this, the World Science Festival, and other efforts to educate people more generally about what science means and what neuroscience means, may change that so that people are capable and educated in a way to receive that information and be more discriminatory and careful about its application. So it's hard to know exactly how persuasive or prejudicial such evidence would be in the courtroom.
The study that you talked about a minute ago, where you were trying to defeat the machine based on facial recognition, gets really into that whole subject of the reliability of eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
Why have eyewitnesses gotten such a bad rep lately? Maybe for a long time now. What's wrong with an eyewitness? Says, I saw him attack me, I'll never forget that face.
So I took a class in law school called Wrongful Convictions, and part of that class tested eyewitnesses. And what it did was it showed a video of a crime scene happening from the perspective of the onlooker, and about the timing that you would have to ordinarily see the faces and the, how far away you would be and things like that. And we watched the video, and then we watched it again, and then we watched it again. You never get to see reality happen 3 times before you over and over again, but we got to. And then we had a lineup of people 1 through 6, and we were asked to identify the perpetrator who we had just seen, right? And remember, normally there's a big time lapse between when you actually see a crime and come in. And we were asked to then vote on who was the person in the lineup. And a class of people who were intently watching, knowing we're about to watch a lineup, divided almost equally between the 6 perpetrators. And the person wasn't in the lineup.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
And, it's the limitations of perception and memory and different perceptions, individuals' ability to actually watch, discriminate, and know what's happening. So, if I am absolutely certain I saw something, chances are I might be wrong, and the chances are pretty high that I might be wrong.
When the police show you a lineup, do they ever say the suspect may or may not be among these people?
There are very detailed instructions about ways to try to decrease bias in lineups, including, for example, trying to have people who are roughly the same height and wearing roughly the same type of clothing, and not having, 5 people who are in a green shirt and 1 person who you think is a suspect in a red shirt, right? and we laugh, but many lineups did a lot of these types of rigged activities. Or, for example, and this is where a lot of the research that I think Anthony's doing is incredibly important, they'll show a picture lineup first, and you'll identify the suspect, so you'll have been primed by actually seeing a photograph of who you think that person is. And then you see a lineup where the person who you thought, but none of the other people in the pictures are in the lineup. And now all of a sudden you say, oh, I remember that person.
Because you're remembering the picture.
You may be.
Yeah, could be. Now, the test that you did with Anthony is related to this, I think, right? Because this sounds to me, correct me if I'm wrong, sounds as though you were testing her for whether or not she recognized the face, even if she wasn't able consciously to say, that's the face I recognize.
So we have done that experiment. We did not do that one with Nita, but we did a variant of that with Nita. And so what Nita experienced and others in our lab have experienced is we bring them in and we show them very simple stimuli, isolated faces, so not the kind of events that you might be probing for a real-world sort of crime or legally relevant sort of event. But they're seeing individual events one at a time during the study period, and then we place them in the scanner, and we show them the faces that they saw during the study period, and we show them novel faces. And we have them make memory decisions, both when they're cooperating and when Nita and others were not cooperating, right, trying to beat the system. And what we wanted to know is, well, by looking at their patterns of brain activity when subjects are seeing old faces and new faces, can we know which faces the subject is recognizing, perceiving as old, which is the subject perceiving as new?
So
and we do quite well there.
You do, no, but you're not recognizing a pattern related to a face, but a pattern related to recognizing a face.
That's critical. Not necessarily, so if I could, not necessarily is it a pattern that's related to having encountered that face before. It's a pattern of activity related to the experience of thinking you encountered the face before.
Oh, not even real recognition, just a sense of familiarity.
Patterns of brain activity for true recognition and false recognition, there are small differences between them that distinguish them, but they're very, very similar. So we can use brain imaging with pretty high accuracy to know whether or not you are having the experience of recognizing that stimulus, that face, but not whether or not you have true memory or false memory.
What were you studying with Nita? What was the point of that?
We did that. Very experiment is the first part, and that's where I could report out that we were somewhere in the mid-70s in terms of our accuracy in detecting memories in Nita's brain versus not. And then in the second part of the experiment, we had her try to beat the system. She engaged countermeasures, and we failed the chance.
Right.
In a prior experiment, though, that set up the study that we did with Nita, we asked the very question that you posed, which is, can you look at brain patterns that are associated with two different kinds of states? One, where the subject does not recognize the face as having been encountered, and the face was old, and the subject doesn't recognize the face that was as encountered, and the face was new. That is, when the person doesn't have the mental experience of recognizing the face, can we detect what they actually encountered versus not? And there we were very, very close to chance.
Close to chance.
Very close to chance.
So
We were
not so
below
effective.
60%.
Yeah.
We know from decades of research now that there are these non-conscious memory traces, these implicit memories that are shaping our behavior all the time. How quickly I can perceive your face. The words that I'm producing are primed and coming to mind based on my recent experience, even though I'm unaware that I'm being shaped by my recent experience. We know that this kind of learning that occurs and is expressed outside of conscious awareness depends upon our cortex. We thought we'd be able to, and we know that in fact with brain imaging you can see small changes in the strength of the activity related to old versus new items, even when people are unaware. We thought we'd be able to leverage that to read out and be able to do accurate classification or accurate detection of whether or not Nita had encountered a face versus not, or our subjects had encountered a face versus not when they weren't aware. But right now, where the technology is it performed quite poorly.
It sounds to me like the work that's being done is extraordinary in tracking what goes on in the brain during these moments of recognition, of lying, and that kind of thing. But it sounds like we're not terribly close to being able to use these things with assurance in the courtroom.
Probably not. I mean, there have been a few attempts already to introduce this kind of information into criminal cases, and they haven't made it past the first stage, which is scientific admissibility. So there have been some evidentiary hearings. Anthony, in fact, testified at one of them about whether or not we've reached a level of scientific certainty or scientific acceptability of information to admit it into the courtroom. But many other types of neuroscience have already shown up in the courtroom. So information about, a person's behavior, or criminal defendant saying, "Don't blame me, blame my brain," is showing up everywhere. And just 5 years ago, that wasn't that common.
How is that phrased in the courtroom? Don't blame me, don't blame.
It's something
blame
like
my
that.
brain.
I didn't consciously choose to do the thing you accuse me of doing. My unconscious brain was in control. An example is, even though I was on drugs and alcohol, I was on drugs and alcohol because of my predisposition to addiction. Or I acted impulsively when I acted, when I killed that person, not with planning and premeditation, which is consistent with this difference in my brain. And just 5 years ago, a lot of that evidence was being kept out of the criminal courtroom because it hadn't reached scientific standards of admissibility. And people thought it would take a lot longer to have a lot of that information be accepted into the courtroom. And more we're seeing that be admitted into the courtroom. And so I think we're not there yet. And particularly when you're talking about truth and lies, which is ultimately what we're trying to achieve in the courtroom, is understand what really happened and what's the truth of the situation. How do we achieve a fair outcome here? This is dangerous information to admit if it's wrong. But if it's better than what we're doing today, if it's better than the biased perceptions we have of what a person is saying on the stand, it might get there faster than we think. And so that's the real question, is what are we actually learning from this information? What is it telling us? Is it telling us truth or lies? Is it telling us just that there's a trace of a memory there? And once we understand what it's actually telling us, does it answer for us or help us answer any of the questions that are important in a legal case?
Well, one of the most amazing studies I saw in the course of making this show was one in which, when I describe it to my friends, their jaws drop. And I think most of us in the outside world would have this reaction and this fear that you actually are on the verge of reading our thoughts, reading our minds, because it involves the scientist being able, when you're, this is the shorthand, oversimplified version, when you're thinking of a picture, the machine can read your mind and print out a fuzzy image similar to that picture. That's really scary.
Yes.
Right? Talk about bad thoughts. So take a look at this video, and then I'd like to get your reaction to it, to how close we are to something like what I just described happening.
Now the brain is scrunched up inside the skull normally, which is inconvenient, so we can inflate it and rotate it around and then flatten it out. And when we flatten it out, we end up with something that's essentially about the size of a large pizza, except it's a brain-shaped pizza.
You're describing my brain.
Everybody's brain, not just yours.
I'm visiting the University of California, Berkeley, where Jack Gallant has been putting people into scanners to watch movies while measuring the activity of some 30,000 points all over the brain's surface.
On this surface of this brain, you can now see that the blue areas are places where there's less brain activity, and the red areas have more brain activity.
As the movies play, the images generate responses across the entire cortex. Some regions respond especially strongly. For instance, when there are faces in the movies, an area involved in face recognition lights up. When the images are of places, a nearby region known to be involved in place recognition activates. But for every image, many, if not all, of the 30,000 points in the brain being recorded respond to a greater or lesser extent, building what Jack Gallant likes to call a world brain dictionary.
Now once you have a world brain dictionary for each point on the brain, you can convert that into a brain world dictionary. And that allows you to take some measurements of brain activity later on and essentially infer what movie people saw.
This is, am I hearing you right? Are you saying you can look at the activity in the brain, not knowing what picture the person was looking at during that activity, and you can reconstruct the picture from that activity?
It's not a perfect representation of the picture.
But you get
it's pretty good.
Some kind of fuzzy picture that looks a lot like it?
If the image is something really common like a face, then we actually get a pretty good reconstruction of a fuzzy face or a person that you can see. If the reconstruction is of something more abstract, like this sort of ink blob here, then there's nothing that we can do to reconstruct that fairly well.
But here's an elephant. There are a lot of elephants.
There are a lot of elephants, but there weren't in our reconstruction library. So the elephant here just looks like a shambling mound.
So the elephant could get away with it.
That's why I said think of pink elephant.
Yeah, right, yes. So this is still at an early stage.
Very early.
And it depends, as I understand it, on getting a backlog, a kind of a baseline of reactions, your reactions to images, and how your brain is activated by looking at a variety of images and parts of images.
Right.
And then that, what you recorded as what's active in your brain when you think of one of those, any particular image, that activation is read, and the machine can put out some kind of
right.
picture.
And this work is sort of a sign of the field change that's happening with brain imaging and functional brain imaging, where when the technology first began to be used by scientists in the early 90s, we would focus in on each of those points, so those tens of thousands of points where we're getting data, and we'd track the amplitude of the signal through time, when you're lying versus telling the truth, when you have a memory versus not. And we'd say, well, at that point, there's more activity in state A versus state B. In the last 7 to 10 years, neuroscientists have begun to glue our data together with sort of machine learning techniques, and that's what you're seeing here, where you're trying to take advantage of the statistics of the signals throughout the brain. And exactly as you noted, what you need to do is first teach a computer to learn what are the primitives, what are the primitive brain patterns that get combined to represent and allow us to see things, think thoughts.
It's striking when you see a video, which I've seen, of the subject thinking of the letter W, and the computer says, here's the letter you're thinking of, puts a W up on the screen within a second or two, and all the letters of the alphabet. I mean, that sounds like a building block for some further ability to be able to get more complex imagery about what you're thinking.
And it's not just images. You know, Jack's work is really neat. He's made this brain world dictionary he's trying to build is also with language. You know, and so this was people watching video clips and training a computer to learn what the brain pattern activity is that corresponds with the images. And now he's done the same thing by reading people's stories and seeing, you know, how the brain processes language, and then being able to make the same kinds of associations between language with the computer learning how language is represented on the brain, and is able to now, you know, have a person hear novel language and then try to predict what it is that the person's hearing. And so the ability to decode brain activity into images or words is very primitive, but these are important proofs of concept that it's more a matter of time and degree of specificity rather than whether or not we'll really be able to decode activity happening in the brain.
So it's primitive, but it's on the road to getting somewhere. How long do you think it'll be? I'm asking both of you. How long?
Much faster than we think.
Faster than we think, but to have reliable stuff in the courtroom where it becomes as a matter of course that it's used to determine guilt. Not talking about sentencing, but guilt. How much time is going to go by before we're able to use it for that?
I'll give a prediction of how fast it will likely end up being admitted, and I think Anthony is in a much better position to then say how reliable he thinks it will be. I'd guess within a decade it's going to be commonplace to have a lot of this information in the criminal courtroom.
And how reliable might it be at that point?
Well, I'm hopeful that the science will be done, the necessary science. Right now we're at a point where there's a lot of promise, and there may be overpromising and efforts to get the data in or the evidence in prematurely. As we continue to amass more data and we figure out what was done well and what wasn't done well in prior studies, hopefully we'll accumulate enough data to inform us as to whether or not it should be entered. I remain a bit skeptical that in the end we'll get over that bar for things like fMRI lie detection. But if I can return just to one place where I hope that neuroscience will start to get into the courts, is to, just like with psychological science, to begin to inform juries about the frailties of the mind and the ways in which the normal operations of our mind and our brains can lead us astray. We go back, and this will just be the one point, go back to eyewitness testimony. What is remarkably persuasive to a jury is an eyewitness who is stating with certainty that I know that this is the individual, I can picture it, it's like I'm reliving that moment. But we now know, by looking at these brain patterns, and brain data and behavioral data, we know that there can be a marked disconnection between a person's confidence in their mental state, in their memory, and reality, what truly occurred. And
it's
hopefully
very
we can educate
useful.
juries.
It sounds like you're saying the greatest use we can put this new knowledge of the brain to is educating the public, who then become jurors, so that they can be wary of a testimony that may not be useful, may not be truthful.
And maybe even educating the jurors in a case. In a number of cases, there are starting to be neuroscientists who are testifying about the limitations of memory. And so when a person is testifying about their certainty, for example, but they're seeing it from a distance, or they suffered from a head injury immediately afterwards, or things like that, being able to use neuroscientific testimony to say, look, this person may be telling you they're quite certain, but from what we understand about the limitations of memory, this is how good we might expect the perception of that event to actually be.
So as a matter of course, bringing neuroscience into the courtroom to determine guilt is not happening now, and it probably won't happen for the next 10 years. However, you can't say that about sentencing, and that's going to be the subject of the next half of this program. But for now, let us thank Nita Farahany and Anthony Wagner for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So when we see an abnormality in the brain, should that affect how the person is sentenced if the person has already been found guilty? We're going to discuss that now with three people who are on the show, Brains on Trial. Our first guest in the second half of the program has the job of determining how a criminal is sentenced. He's a U.S. District Judge in New York, an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School, and he writes about and teaches classes on neuroscience and the law. Please welcome Judge Jed Rakoff. Welcome. Our second participant conducts clinical research on people with major mental illnesses, psychopaths, sex offenders, and addicts. He teaches at the University of New Mexico and runs a mobile MRI clinic. Please welcome Kent Kiehl.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you.
And finally, a man that we welcome who knows what's in the minds of teenagers. A perplexing question that many a parent has asked. He's the chief of brain imaging at the National Institute of Mental Health, a professor at Johns Hopkins School, and a practicing psychiatrist. We're happy to have as our final participant with us, Giedd. Hello, Jay. So we're going to be talking a lot about adolescents and psychopaths, two hopefully distinct categories. And Jay has been doing a really interesting thing. During most of the lives of your children, you've been scanning their brains.
Right.
I bet many parents wish they could have done that and have your ability to read the scans. Before we talk about it, let's take a look at a video that shows a little bit about Jay. First, I'll be meeting his children.
My son Jordan.
Hi, Jordan.
Nice to meet you.
And my daughter Sasha.
Hi, Sasha.
My children and study participants. So
you've been scanning them.
Yes, I've been watching their brains grow and develop through the years.
From what age?
From 3 and from 5.
I'm really eager to look inside your brain. Is one of you going to be able to show us your brain today?
I guess I will.
Okay, great. So let's take a look and put him in the scanner. That'd be great. This is Jordan's 10th time in his father's scanner. His sister Sasha has been scanned over 20 times. And together they've contributed to an unprecedented picture of how the makeup of a young brain changes as it matures. Can you show me how that changed in Jordan's brain over the years?
We can from
You've been photographing. You've been scanning him for a long time now.
So this is
what age do these start at?
So this
Can you hold that for us?
It goes from ages 3 to 25, and it's actually combining people across different chunks.
So this is not just Jordan.
Right, but it's actually part of it. Ours is actually in this one. And what we see in these colors is blue can be seen as maturation in the sense it's getting closer to the adult brain. And what I'm going to draw your attention to is this part of the brain right here.
Here?
Yeah, the last to turn blue.
Right.
And this is a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex,
Right.
and involved in impulse control, long-range planning, the hard stuff, integrating everything to make decisions.
That's the part that should come in first. I wish mine had. So, that's I didn't understand when we were talking, and I'm glad you straightened me out that you were combining your children's brain images with those of other people to get an average of brain development, right?
Yeah, correct. But what really struck us was 25 seemed ridiculously late. So as adolescent psychiatrists, we were wondering, should we follow people at age 16 or 18? By 16, they're already winning Olympic medals. They're basically, grown up. But so when we saw 25 was still a very dynamic time in the part of the brain involved in judgment, decision-making, controlling impulses, it seemed so late to us that so many decisions are made long before age 25 about our careers, our spouses, whether to go into the military or not. So that was the most shocking part for us, was that this part of the brain involved in wisdom and long-range planning was still under construction throughout the entire second decade.
Under construction.
Yeah, so not broken, not absent,
yeah.
but still not finished, which actually turns out to have enormous advantages for us as a species. So there's many more upsides to having a brain that hasn't finished changing, hasn't locked in early. And we tend to focus more on the negative aspects of the teen brain still being under development. But as a species, it's why we're here and the Neanderthals are not here, is that we've been able to have these options stay open way, way longer than any other species.
Let's talk about that in a second. I don't want to glide over too quickly the fact that it's sort of striking that you're finding, that neuroscience is finding, that the brain, especially the areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortex that controls impulsivity and makes other executive decisions, that develops so late in life, in maybe the late 20s, right?
Yes.
And yet, we have embedded in our justice system that 18 is the point at which you can be tried as an adult, where you can be given adult responsibilities and considered to be an adult in your decision making. How did that happen? Why didn't we learn from common experience that 18 is too early?
Yeah, and it's sort of all over the map. Age 7 is when you can have the age of reason in Catholicism to be responsible for your sins, and age 13 for consenting to sex or marriage, 21 to drink, 18 to vote, 18 for a mayor, 21 for governor, 25 for representative, 30 senator, 35 presidents. It's all over the place. And you would think if there's some stage at which your brain is ready to fend for itself, that society doesn't need to protect it, it would have some commonality. But from 7 to 35, we haven't come to any sort of consensus about when the brain is ready to be on its own. And neuroscience may have a role in that, but it's not obvious to kind of note, like, when is the brain ready to be fully responsible in a legal sense or educational sense or personal sense.
Judge Rakoff, when you are sentencing somebody who is just, say, over the line, just past the age of 18, what do you take into account, if anything, about the age of the person?
The difficulty with a lot of the neuroscience data is that it's generalizations. You don't know from the data whether this particular individual has a mature brain or a not mature brain. You asked before, why do we pick 18? It probably relates historically to most people were out of high school. Back in the day when people didn't go to college so much, that was the age when they went out and started their own lives, became employed, left the family, and things like that. It had very little to do with mental state. It had to do with social conditions. So we don't have anything like a neuroscientific test that will say that this 17-year-old or this 18-year-old who's before the sentencing judge already has a well-developed prefrontal cortex or not.
And then, pardon me for interrupting, but this is probably related, am I correct? Probably related to the fact that these studies are all done as averages. So on average, we know that it's not until the late 20s that the prefrontal cortex develops, but in the person who's up before you may be well developed because the average is going to have to be a combination of ups and downs. So you don't know. Now, following that line of thought, would it be a good thing or not a good thing to have have the person scanned to find out where they are on that spectrum before you sentence them?
So, as a practical matter, I think that at this point, both the neuroscience isn't there and also the cost would be quite prohibitive, but both of those things could change. It was indicated by the previous speakers. There's also, I think, an invasion of privacy issue. You were talking before about Fourth and Fifth Amendment issues, but there's a more general privacy issue that I think has to be taken account of here. But having said all that, the reason why neuroscience is coming more in at the sentencing stage than at the guilt or innocence stage is because judges are allowed to pretty much look at anything. They're trying to, a conscientious judge is trying to get the whole picture of the human being that he or she has to then decide whether or not to send to prison. It's a very difficult decision. You welcome evidence of any kind, even if it's only, if you will, half-baked. I think if there was consent to the brain imaging being done at the sentencing stage, judges would be accepting of it.
Is it possible that just as you would want to make sure the jury is educated about the value of neuroimaging as it stands at the present moment, you would want judges to be aware of that too? You would want them to be informed? I assume they're not all equally informed.
Well, of course, judges are deemed as a matter of law to be expert in all issues. But now going to reality, yes, of course, that would be very helpful. And actually, there have been a whole bunch of programs that the federal judicial system has undertaken to educate judges about neuroscience.
What do you think, Kent? In your experience, would it be a good idea if it became financially feasible to introduce scanning into the sentencing process?
So it's a good question. I mean, we spend about $2.3 trillion a year on crime in the United States, which is more than we spend on, or about the same as we spend on all healthcare. So we're already spending a lot of money. So if the question is, do I sentence them to 1 year or 20 years because let's say their brain might be different, well then that's a lot of money. And then the scanning becomes more cost effective to do that. And with respect to age and things like that, those are pretty, as Jay's work illustrates, those are pretty well instantiated in brain in terms of structure and function. And the state of the art right now is we can get pretty good at that telling how old you are from a brain scan. And so it could be the case that people are going to make those arguments. And it's Jay's developmental neuroscience that has shown or been most informative of changing the Supreme Court's ideas and thinking about sentences for youth, for example, eliminating death penalty, life without the possibility of parole. And that is getting a lot of traction at that level in terms of influencing how we decide what to sentence somebody to.
But if I could just interrupt, the Supreme Court has dealt with this on a global generalization level. It's very different. Most 18-year-olds do not commit serious crimes. There you have a person who has committed a serious crime. I don't think it is sufficient to say, well, don't send them to jail because we know that on average 18-year-olds' brains are not as well developed in the impulse control area as people who are 30. That's true, it's relevant, but it's not by any means the whole story, as we know from the simple fact that most 18-year-olds do not commit serious crimes.
However, the Supreme Court, I think in 2 cases, has ruled that on how severe you can be with the punishment if the person is.
Yes, what's that? That is technically it's based on stuff that has nothing to do with the neuroscience, but non-technically,
Yeah.
I think what it's fair to say was going on is the recognition that a juvenile can be rehabilitated in a way that many adults cannot. And that, in part, is a function of the fact that their brains are still maturing.
Now, Kent, you
I almost jumped on him.
you showed us. I didn't need a brain scan to see a activation in your brain that when Judge Rakoff said
I
that.
would just say that, with the people that I mostly study, individuals who get in a lot of trouble, we haven't really tried to treat them very hard, And so I wouldn't say we can't treat anybody, because I don't think that the resources have really been put to try to actually put state-of-the-art treatment, into helping some offenders or get back on their feet or not reoffend. And so I like to reserve judgment until we've actually invested, as much on studying psychopathy or other questions like that, until we've actually really tried.
No, but again, the statistics are that people who commit crimes in their 20s are the most likely to commit crimes again. It eases off after they get to about 40. Very few people commit crimes, even if they've been career criminals, after about the age of 40 or 45. People who commit crimes when they're 13, 14, 15, if properly treated and not thrown right into prison, will frequently not commit future crimes and that will be at a greater rate than would be the people who are committing crimes at 20 and 30. So of course, Ken is right that as a society, we don't put as many resources into treatment generally and rehabilitation generally as might be ideal. The sad history, which none of us like to admit, is that in the 1950s, rehabilitation was the watchword, at least of the federal judicial system, and it failed. And crime rates went way up. They probably went up for 100 different reasons having nothing to do with how many resources were put into rehabilitation, but there it was. And as a political reality, you're not going to get huge resources placed into the rehabilitation of defendants generally. It's sad, it's not good, but it's the truth. But I think there is a more general social recognition that juveniles are more amenable to rehabilitative measures.
Well, the whole question of how juveniles get in trouble, lacking a certain amount of restraint from the executive parts of the brain, like executive functions in the brain, is an interesting one. And I was really surprised to see the study where the mere presence of peers among adolescents was a contributing factor to reckless behavior. And we often hear about peer pressure. This is just peer presence. The mere presence of other adolescents seems to be a risky situation. Take a look at this video and you'll see what I mean.
While lying in a scanner, Alex is about to play a game that involves driving a simulated car through a series of stoplights.
He made it through the first one without getting killed.
Deciding at each one whether or not to risk going through on yellow.
I would have stopped.
Alex is deciding whether to put speed ahead of safety while alone in the scanner. But that, as far as Alex believes, is about to change.
Hey Alex, how you doing? Good. I have your friends here, and they're gonna be watching you play the next round of tasks, so they're gonna talk to you a little bit, okay?
Okay, cool.
All right, you can discuss the phone.
Hey Alex, you still alive in there?
Oh yeah.
Nice.
Go ahead.
Hey Alex, it's Paul. How's it going?
Pretty good. How you doing?
I'm good, man. Good luck in there. We're gonna be watching you.
They're gonna be watching me.
Actually, they won't. But Alex doesn't know that. As far as he's concerned, his friends are watching his every choice.
Crash. Bang. Is it my imagination, or is he having a few more crashes this time?
No, he is having more crashes, and that's what we find, that when adolescents play this game, They crash more often when they know their friends are watching them than they do when they're by themselves. During adolescence, peers are so important that their presence activates the brain's reward circuitry, and that makes adolescents, under that condition, pay more attention to the potential rewards of a risky choice and less attention to the potential downside.
Oh, bravo, you did a great job.
Thank you.
Your friends are proud of you.
Oh, really?
Just don't get in the car with them. I don't know if you heard, I congratulated him, then I said, don't do any driving anymore. Well, that's so interesting that he didn't need teens in the car urging him to do dangerous things. They weren't even there. He just needed to believe he was surrounded by friends. And as I've heard, one friend makes you more reckless, two friends makes you even more, three makes you even more. So this is so interesting to me compared to what you were saying before about Neanderthals, because I think you've told me that there's evidence that Neanderthals didn't have an adolescence the way our kids have adolescence.
Yeah,
Or cars.
Or cars, yes.
Critically, well,
those
they had
the
those
brakes, those little the Flintstone ones. Exactly.
Hey, I watch TV.
I mean, I think you'd say that they had adolescence, but not teenagers.
Yeah.
So their adolescence occurred before age 10. And they can determine this from fossils of their teeth and tell how old they were. So if you're a 10-year-old Neanderthal, you're not living with your parents, you're living with your children. And so this idea of sort of having the teen years, particularly that second decade, when we're still with our parents, when we're still having the protection, but also the cost of having this very long time where we need other people to protect us and feed us and take care of us. It's this trade-off between enormous cost but enormous benefit. And this is what I think made us more survivable than the Neanderthals, that by having this teenage period when our brain is still able to optimize to an environment at the North Pole, the equator, everywhere between, that we keep options open, and this was the key to our survival. But now we have a huge new challenge in terms of technology and the way that people interact with each other through Facebook and social media drastically changed in the last 15 years. The way that we play instead of outside more with video games, the way that we learn has all changed just incredibly in the last 15 years.
It's interesting because it sounds like you're saying that the ability to innovate,
adapt,
and adapt, to try new things, some new things that may even seem somewhat reckless, to move away from your family and strike out in a new direction on your own. The modern humans had that, whereas the Neanderthals apparently didn't have it.
Right.
But the modern humans at that time also didn't have this tool for maiming oneself, which is the car and other instruments,
yes.
drugs, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that we have had the advantage, perhaps, of the innovative spirit of the adolescent to help us become the humans we are.
Yeah.
But now we're not adapted to the tools we have for hurting ourselves with that very spirit.
Risk-taking, sensation-seeking, and moving away from parents to peers is very fundamental. All social mammals do those three things, but they weren't always lethal in early ages without cars and guns and drugs of things. So we kind of have this Stone Age brain in a computer age world interactions that are accounting for a lot of phenomenon.
And that's something common to all of us. In our culture, we all go through this adolescence, and at a certain point, we have to cope with the next wave of adolescence among our children and so on. But Kent, you've studied a more special problem among psychopaths, and it's so interesting how you were able to scan so many psychopaths by this innovative idea that you came up with to have a mobile scanning unit. Let's take a look at a video and you'll get a picture of what Kent's been able to do.
We're on our way to the Western New Mexico Correctional Facility to study the brain of a psychopath.
What's their motivation for doing it?
Most of them are like anybody else. They like to get a picture of their brain.
Yes.
Hi there.
Hi.
Come on in.
Mike, like the other inmates scanned here, has already undergone a detailed history and series of interviews to determine the extent of his psychopathic tendencies.
Psychopathy is a constellation of 20 different traits, and you have to have a majority of those traits: the lack of empathy, guilt, and remorse. They're superficial. They tend to be a little conning and manipulative, and they're very impulsive. And they tend to be hot-headed, and they tend to are verbally aggressive too, and so that ends up getting themselves in quite a bit of trouble. That's why we work with prisoners, is that psychopaths tend to end up congregating in prisons because they make bad decisions and they're impulsive.
This first scan's going to take about 8 minutes. All I need you to do is keep real still.
The goal of Kent Kiehl's research is to see if psychopaths not only think differently from the rest of us, but have different brains.
What we found is that basically the limbic system in the brain, the emotional circuitry in the brain, is just less dense.
Kent Kiehl's research suggests that psychopaths relied less on emotion in making moral judgments because the emotional centers of their brains are underdeveloped, and that this can be revealed in a brain scan.
Kent, what are the attributes, what are the typical signs that a person is psychopathic?
So throughout history, psychiatry has tried to answer that question, and we've evolved to the point where we generally have a list right now, and it's embodied in a tool called the psychopathy checklist, which is essentially 20 characteristics. And there are things like they're glib and impulsive, they lie a lot, they get in a lot of different types of trouble, they lack empathy, guilt, and remorse, they're impulsive, and they tend to make a lot of bad decisions over and over again. And this process starts and is found very early. So starting as early as age 5, 6, 7, they appear to be different, all the way up to accelerating that antisocial behavior in adolescence, and then on to typically often getting themselves in trouble.
And you can see that happening in the brain. You can see the formations in the brain that indicate that people will have those signs of psychopathy?
Well, again, these traits are, it's important to understand that they're present in order to assess a trait at home, at work, at school, with family and friends. And so it has to be present in a lot of different areas of their life, not just one area. And when it's present in all of those areas, then we can rank them high on those traits. And the answer to your question is yes, their brains are different. I mean, their behavior is very different, and we know behavior comes from the brain. And so we're now able to use these machines to understand how they're different and then potentially how they got that way.
What you mentioned treatment before. Is there treatment that is available and effective for an adult psychopath?
So we don't have good data, and there is currently no effective treatment for adults who have these traits. And again, we're really talking about just about 10%, 15% of individuals who are incarcerated, less than, well, one in this room, one in 150.
One in this room?
Yeah. Usually
Can
a
you
man.
just pick the person out? I mean, you don't have to like point or anything.
So we're talking about a small fraction of individuals who are incarcerated, but still a significant amount. Basically, they have developed it differently. Sorry, your question was how early?
No, I didn't say that, but that's a good answer.
Treatment.
You're free to answer whatever I say and don't say.
So you asked about treatment, sorry. So we don't have a good answer for adults, but Wisconsin had a problem with crime rising rates. And one of the interesting things about the state of Wisconsin is that their political system is right adjacent to the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, I mean just 100 yards away. And those politicians went down the street to talk to their old professors, and the professor said, well, what do we do about this problem with juvenile crime? And so in a landmark kind of decision, they cut out money from the Department of Corrections and sent it to the Mendota Mental Health Facility, which is right on the lake there in Madison, Wisconsin.
So they went, to some extent, from punishment to treatment.
Yeah, well, what happened was they created a state-of-the-art treatment program from the ground up to work with youth who are on the steepest possible trajectory. Now, we don't know if these kids would have been given the label or met the criterion for psychopathic traits, but they were on the highest risk trajectory.
And that's got a different name. What is that called?
Well, they typically refer to kids who are developing these traits as having callous and unemotional traits. We don't try to use the word psychopathic because it's so pejorative with kids and labeling
and you're
concerns.
worried about branding them for life when
right,
in fact
exactly.
they may not turn into
Absolutely.
psychopaths.
But what the Wisconsin program showed is that when you take and you get a state-of-the-art program and you build it from the ground up, you can actually affect good change. And what was the change? Well, the kids that went through this program were about 30% less likely to reoffend than kids who went through the system as normal. But most importantly, they were 50% less likely to violently reoffend than the other kids. In fact, this is staggering data, but the kids in the control group, over 200 kids who were released, they killed 16 people in a 4-year period upon release, whereas the kids that went through the Mendota Juvenile Treatment Center program, they didn't kill anyone. And so right there, it's extremely cost effective to treat early with a program like this, because the kids don't come back to crime. They get out earlier because they don't accumulate institutional infractions. But it really is the future savings in terms of the cost of violent crime. And I mean, it's impossible. The economists have done the analysis, but you can't estimate what it costs to kill someone. I mean, the emotional harm and everything else that comes along with it. So I'm a big fan of this program, and my trailer goes up to Wisconsin as well. So the jokes are out there. Yes, I live in New Mexico and I have a trailer, but it's a very nice trailer.
What about this, combining a couple of thoughts that have come up? If the presence of other adolescents is so important and such a risky situation for an adolescent, to be in the presence of other adolescents, what about when you send an adolescent to prison and he's in the company of other adolescents who are training him to be an effective criminal? Is he more likely to be affected by them because of the sensitivity he has to his peers?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that always strikes me is that reading is only about 5,200 years old. So as a species, reading is very recent. We don't learn best by reading. We learn best by example and by being in a group and learning from each other. And that's sort of the default. That's how we're best at learning. And so particularly during the teenage years, you need to find your team, your group, where your second family in terms of loyalty. You need to separate from your natal family, but a big part of what the teen brain does is social, finding the right team, because that's how we stayed alive. We weren't the biggest, strongest, fastest, but by being in a group, we were able to survive. And so what happens right at this stage when the brain is searching for a team, or searching for what kind of person they're going to be, what sort of values, then if their models are other prisoners or older prisoners or better prisoners, it's a kind of a horrible situation for a developing brain to be in. It's not an easy alternative, but I think more so than younger or older, the adolescent brain is particularly sensitive to learning from peers.
And there is data. So from the Federal Bureau of Prison, a colleague of mine when I was at Yale, Keith Chen, he's an economist, he did some analysis of, there's a judicial decision-making tool that decides if they send him to minimum or medium or maximum prison. And it's got some error with it, so sometimes a guy can fall in the middle. And so if they study just those individuals, kind of a randomization technique, then what they find is if you send someone to maximum security and then when they're released, they're more likely to reoffend than had you sent them to medium or minimum, largely because of the people that they might be associated with at those different facilities. So definitely sentencing a child or a teen to a facility is likely to increase the chances that they're going to reoffend.
So does any of this come into play when you're sentencing someone, Judge Rakoff?
Modestly, not a lot. You have to have a little bit of historical perspective here. The legal system, in general, judges in particular, have been repeatedly burned by science that turned out to be not as good as it was hyped to be. In the 19th century, the brain science of the time was phrenology. You could tell, and there are a bunch of reported cases where people went to jail or didn't go to jail depending on the bumps on their heads.
Yeah, but they came out of jail with more bumps than they had when they were in.
In the early 20th century, the science du jour was eugenics, where it was said that a lot of your mental traits were inherited. There were forced sterilizations approved by the Supreme Court of the United States, and it wasn't until that became the favorite science of Adolf Hitler that it really fell into disrepute. In the mid-20th century, there was a huge infatuation with psychoanalysis, and all sorts of decisions were made at sentencing on the basis of Freudian concepts that have since been placed in, really rejected. So neuroscience is better science, I believe, than what I've just discussed, but it's an infant science, And I think we have to be very careful before we assume that it can be the decision maker in one of these cases. It's a factor. It's something you should look at, but it can't be the be-all or end-all. It's just not that good a science.
Well, let's say you're facing a young man who's just 18, and you have a range of sentences you could impose. You could put him in jail, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Does his age have any bearing, or the way he presents himself at that age, on whether or not you think it's going to actually be good for him or good for society to expose him to the prison population, especially for that length of time?
For sure, but you would take account, for example, also, if you don't send him to prison, is he going to be in a neighborhood where he is already learning to be a drug dealer? Is there some indication that he is amenable to the deterrent value of prison? There are a host of factors, I'm just touching a few of them, that you would have to balance very carefully, and it's not easy. But there's no magic bullet in this area. And there are all sorts of dilemmas. Kent mentioned that there's no known effective treatment for adult psychopaths. So what does that mean? If a psychopath commits a very serious crime, and you would normally give someone who committed that crime 20 years, do you give the psychopath 40 years because you think there's a higher risk that when he gets out, he'll commit that crime again? I think the legal system would have difficulties with that kind of quote unequal treatment.
But Ken, doesn't this happen anyway?
Yes.
When the psychopath is up for parole, is the knowledge that he is in fact a certified psychopath, doesn't that work against him if he's looking for parole?
It does. So risk assessments are typically done upon making a decision for parole or granting parole. They can also be done in a pre-sentencing report that you could order or ask for, of course, and it would be part of that risk assessment. So a high score in psychopathy, so you have somebody, what does that mean, who has all of those traits? Well, they are more likely to reoffend in the absence of anything else going on. So but age is another predictor of reoffending. There's a lot of other type of victim. There's a lot of things that go into those risk assessments. And most states employ some type of risk assessment to make parole decisions.
So there's no parole system, there's no such thing as federal parole anymore, and there hasn't been since 1983, so I don't confront this in the federal system. But Ken just mentioned two factors that cut in opposite directions. If you know a guy is a psychopath, and let's say he's 25, and you could sentence him from anywhere to 20 to 60 years. The fact that he's a psychopath might tempt you, and some might argue you should give him a longer sentence because of the likelihood that he's going to commit new crimes when he gets out. On the other hand, even psychopaths have been shown to decrease their criminality after the age of 40. So then the argument would be, well, he's 25 now, we'll give him 20 years because when he gets out he'll be 45, and he's
With
not so...
5 to spare, just to be sure.
And he's not so likely to commit crime. So my only point is there are multiple factors you have to take account of, and we do not have anything like a scientific measure or unscientific measure that allows you to say, oh, that's the right sentence.
And these are generalities, I have to be clear. I mean, on average, an individual who scores high is more likely to reoffend than someone who scores low or just in the middle. And all the other variables give you kind of an equation. And judges are often asked, especially in the judicial education seminars we do, can you give me a little bit better science, or can you give me the state of the art today so that I can make a better decision? Because simply asking the defendant, do you feel bad for what you did, is a very poor prognostic indicator of whether or not they're going to reoffend. And so we try to just put the best science in front of them that we can.
Even if we have an episode on the show Brains on Trial where remorse is being picked up by the fMRI machine, and then we bring in an actress who acts remorse, and she shows the same reading. So even at the moment, even the machine is going to be fooled by that. And certainly, I wonder if at the moment people on parole boards are better at machines at figuring out fake remorse.
No.
No?
No. No, in fact, there's a study out of Canada that found that even when the parole board knew the offender was high risk, psychopaths, like someone who has psychopathy, they are more likely to get released. And why, you might be shocked, and why, even if in front of that knowledge, is because psychopaths talk, and they talk a lot. And that can overwhelm the parole board, in a sense, with all this information and promises and other types of things that other offenders who score low don't make, because they just aren't that glib. Yeah. And so the glibness actually plays to their advantage when it's asked. I mean, I see it all the time. Like in different states, individuals who score high in psychopathy are more likely to end up on road crews, and then they get in trouble on those things, and they end up doing, all these other types of privileges. Why? Because they're likely to ask. And so they're very disinhibited socially, so that engages the system, and the system has to push back, and often they end up getting themselves in.
But as glib as they are, you can tell, I think, from talking to a psychopath often, just by the language he uses and the thought process, that he's probably psychopathic. Isn't that right?
Well, so I've been fooled before, and I've spent, 20 years in maximum security prisons. So the trick is
You'll
that...
get parole eventually.
Yeah, I get it. Thanks. Thank you. My application's on your desk. So the real issue is that in order to assess these traits, you can't just do it from an interview. And so the test that we use actually takes the collateral information, so social worker histories, family histories, school, employment, financial, all that information that's available in order to make sure you're getting an unbiased, a perspective. To just trust the interview is you can't get a good answer. You don't get good valid data. So you can get hints, and I've definitely...
What's an example of a hint you get?
Well, my spidey sense, when it can go off many times, when you're talking to somebody and the way they describe something that they've done, for example, where they'll tell you things that would surprise even me, about I don't know, how graphic something was, how they'll just describe it, and it doesn't affect them at all. Whereas then you talk to somebody who scores very low, and they'll never talk about those things. And if they do talk about it, and you can pull it out of them in the interview, they get welled up with emotion, other types of things. Sometimes they even cry in my interviews when you're asking them questions and things like that. So whereas a psychopath will just tell you, he has no concerns. It doesn't ever impact them the same way. That's part of the things that we're studying.
Yeah. What do you think, Jay, do you have any hopes, any goals over the next few years about what your work may be able to contribute to the justice system?
I think one of the challenges is that there's so much individual variability. So 12-year-olds may be very responsible and forward-thinking and non-impulsive, where 50, 60-year-olds never overcome that as an individual. So the big challenge is going from these group average data to individuals. And the other is that things change moment to moment. So if I were to scan everyone in this room 10 times, I could find in most people, here's a brain that at this moment is impulsive, is not good at long-range judgment. So you'd almost have to ideally have the person commit the crime in the scanner, to see, which might be a good episode of a TV show of some sort of what you could do from,
I think we have a series here.
Yeah, but that's the big challenge, is to go from these sort of group differences between. Another one we haven't talked about is males and females. So males, 50 times more likely to be on death row, and so we have these, predictions and factors. But the great challenge for us then is to make this useful at an individual level, and not so much for guilt, innocence from my perspective, but what to do about it. So if we do find somebody has these traits, is there something we can do to modify that for the future? And I think that's where there's the most optimism. If we can use the brain imaging as a measure of how well we're doing, how well we're sort of changing these capabilities. But in the sort of guilt innocent part, it's so difficult because the brain is changing, every 20 times a second in terms of it's really hard to capture the brain at the time of the crime, and that's essentially what you'd almost have to do to make it valid.
I get the impression from talking to all of you today that neuroscience, as it relates to the justice system, is fascinating and throws light on us as humans in a scholarly way, in a way that gives us knowledge about ourselves, but may not be as useful as many people would like to believe it is in the courtroom, in the process of doing the justice system.
Well, so I'll take a shot at that one. So there's definitely, I think, a lot of areas where neuroscience is critical to be used in case. So if you have a client that has a tumor, for example, and that's relevant for them, helping them make bad decisions. And then, well, what about if it was a small stroke or something? You should have neuroscience, to evaluate brain scans, to evaluate that. And what does reduced gray matter density mean for responsibility in making decisions? Maybe there is a chance that that might be used. And so the fun part about this for me is that I just get to drive judges crazy, because the lectures that we give, they realize that this is coming if it's not already here, and they're going to need to be knowledgeable about this information. So are defense attorneys. There's lots of claims of ineffective assistance of counsel for failing to do some sort of scan when the client had a history of head injury or something else that might have been relevant. And so if you have or your client has a mental health problem, something like that makes them really ill, like a schizophrenia or something like that, if it is a big stakes case and something, then it might be relevant. So for example, Hinckley, early 80s, shot President Reagan. That was the first time in the United States brain scans were used to support a psychiatric diagnosis. And so at the time, the brain scans were a CT scan or a CAT scan that showed enlarged ventricles and sulci, which was consistent with what we knew about, that's the fluid-filled spaces of the brain. That was consistent with patients with schizophrenia had those on average, not individually, but on average.
Yeah, but that's a good example of being careful for what you wish, because after Hinckley was acquitted on grounds of insanity, 37 states changed their legislation to make the test for insanity much more difficult to meet than it had been previously. So there was a public reaction against that was not what had been anticipated. But I wanted to mention that I think the place you may see neuroscience first coming into the courtroom is in civil cases. And an example might be a typical issue in a personal injury case is whether the person whose injury was suffered 2 years before is still feeling pain or not. And he will always say, yes, I am feeling pain, and the defense will always say, oh, he's making it up. And neuroscience is one of the few sciences that has the potential to distinguish those two, because if you can identify the parts of the brain where the pain is shown, so to speak, that where the brain is activated, then you can distinguish those two situations, whereas external physical symptoms won't distinguish between pain and not pain.
And that's coming.
That's coming.
Yes.
It sounds like it's all on the way, and the fear I hear is from neuroscientists is I hope it doesn't get there before it's truly effective.
Right, but in the adversarial system, if the science is potentially relevant for their client, then they want to be able to use it.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's, so they're going to push, the lawyers will push the frontiers. They call me all the time. I want to know if this is relevant yet for my client. Yeah. And in some cases, it absolutely is, like some of the things we just talked about. And in other cases, it's not there yet. It would not meet an admissibility standard. And so, but they need to be evaluating this because it's going to get to the point where it will be viable.
But my plea would be that we replace imperfect science with better science, not anti-science. In terms of that, it's too dichotomous. Is it good or not? It's nuanced. It's better than nothing, but not perfect. And there's a danger, I think, into lumping everything into phrenology or science screwed up. Forget about they're not who needs them kind of thing. That we need to be careful not to do that. We need to sort of realize that science is ever improving and go in that direction, as opposed to invalidate science.
The dynamic of it is that judges and jurors, not being versed in science, are liable to give more weight to something that has the good name of science attached to it. And lawyers will be pushing to introduce science that's not very good. So I think there are dangers there.
So that's not a problem with the science, by the way. That's a problem with the lawyers.
Well, it's all... Yeah, it's always the lawyers. We know that.
What's reassuring for me to see is that the scientists who've been on the stage today are just as interested in making sure it's effective as you are, Judge Rakoff, because they don't want it misused. It's after all, their work, and they don't want their work abused by people using it unfairly. We really are running out of our time today. It's a fascinating subject. I invite you to see the guests we've had today and others on the program when it's on the air on PBS in two installments, September 11th and September 18th at 10 p.m. Join us and see an even fuller version of this, and also on the web, many more things on this subject. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you for participating. Thank you very much.